Good afternoon or good morning at your side of the ocean. I'm happy to welcome Professor Norris from Miami University. Thank you for being here today with us. ICEUR is, thank you very much. ICEUR is interviewing international experts on Russia and Ukraine in order to improve our understanding of what is currently going on there. So you're a professor of Russian history and the director of the Havighurst Center for Russian and Post-Soviet Studies. You have written a number of books, mostly dealing with Russian and Soviet cultural history. Well, at the moment, Russia is invading Ukraine, and intense fighting is being reported as well from some of the large cities. What is your assessment of the present situation in Ukraine? What do you think are the goals of the Russian invasion?
Well, thank you for having me. I think two things are going on simultaneously in Russia and Ukraine right now. Two fronts are being tightened. The first, as you mentioned, Lucas, is of course the invasion of Ukraine and the advancement of Russian troops headed toward major Ukrainian cities, as well as the shelling of these cities, continued shelling of these cities in Kyiv, in Kharkiv and elsewhere. It seems, according to reports today that I'm reading, that the heroic resistance of the Ukrainian forces could only go on for so much longer if Putin continues down this front. And what we're seeing, I think, in that regard is more or less what happened in Chechnya during the Second Chechen War and in Syria when Russia intervened in Syria. As far as the goals of Putin, I think we have to take him seriously, that he doesn't think Ukraine is a real state, and that he aims to eliminate it somehow and establish a friendlier regime in Kyiv, friendlier toward Russia, of course. The second front, though, is also domestic in Russia. What transpired over the weekend is we saw, for instance, on Friday, the Russian Duma unanimously passed a law against fake news or the falsification of history, which of course itself is ridiculous. That is, any attempt to declare the war a war, or anything that anyone says that goes against the government line, is now illegal. We saw a number of servile letters being issued, including a number of universities. St. Petersburg State University, for example, issued a letter in support of Putin and his goals in Ukraine. Just yesterday, the Patriarch of Russia, Patriarch Kirill, gave a sermon where he declared that the war was just, and it was an attempt to prevent gay pride parades from happening in Ukraine. So it fits with this absurd, over-the-top declaration from Putin when he announced the war, that genocide was occurring in eastern Ukraine against Russians there, and that the goal of the war was denazification.
Thank you for your assessment. You have mentioned that Putin doesn't think that Ukraine is a real state. So he hasn't only questioned this right now, he has done this from the past. And in 2021, he published an essay called On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. What is your perspective as a historian?
Yes, I think much has been made that Putin sees the world in Soviet terms, and in certain ways he does. I think his view of Ukraine actually goes back to the 19th century version of the Russian Empire, where the Tsars didn't also think Ukraine was a real country and Ukrainians were a separate people. In fact, the preferred term of the Tsars was to refer to Ukraine as Little Russia. And at various points, as Ukrainian nationhood developed in the 19th century, the Tsar started countering that idea and passing laws against the use of Ukrainian language in Ukrainian publications, culminating in the 1876 secret ukaz by Alexander II. So this is the reformer Tsar Alexander II, who in the German spa town of Bad Ems passed a law that prevented the publication of anything in Ukrainian in the Russian Empire. And that law more or less remained in force until 1905 in the revolution then. So it fits very much with this this imperialist, what we could call a neo-imperialist idea that Putin has to suggest that Ukraine is a hodgepodge state. It's been created not by any real sentiment among Ukrainians, who after all aren't really a people or a separate people, and it's been foisted on people, and divisions have resulted from this artificial state. So Putin's pronouncements, including quite clearly in this 5,000-word essay he wrote last summer, are to suggest that really Russians and Ukrainians are brothers, that Ukrainians just need their evil regime removed from them, their Nazi fascist regime removed from them, and then everyone will get along, and Putin can then restore this 19th century vision of the Russian Empire in that part of the world. And it includes Belarus too, of course, that again, not often seen as a separate country or a separate people.
Thank you. You just said the relationship between Russia and Ukraine has always been, well, complex. But many observers have described 2014 as a turning point, since it's the year of the annexation of Crimea. How do you think has the idea of Ukrainianness as a concept changed since then?
Yes, a good question. I think my first answer would be to remind us of a little more recent history. You know, in August 1991, Ukrainians went to the polls to vote to determine whether or not Ukraine should be a separate state, that is, to declare their independence from the Soviet Union. And it was a very simple question: do you support Ukraine being independent? And overwhelmingly, Ukrainians said yes. I mean, you know, something like 90% of the eligible voters voted, and in all but one region of Ukraine at that time, over 80% of Ukrainians said yes. The only region that didn't get the 80% or higher vote was Crimea, which was still a 55% vote. So just 30 years ago, Ukrainians declared quite clearly in a very visible way their desire to be independent. Now, what Ukraine meant at that moment in the wake of the Soviet Empire was an open question. And you know, Ukrainians ever since have debated about whether or not Ukraine and Ukrainianness should be a civic state, an ethnic state. Of course, they've debated whether or not what the relationship with Europe or Russia should be. But certainly those questions have gotten clearer and more unified since 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. Ukraine has emerged in the last 8 years as much more of a civic nation. That is, it's fine for people to speak Russian, but still consider themselves Ukrainian. And I think certainly, I mean, the buildup of troops and now the invasion have only furthered that notion, which is the, you know, the antithesis of what Putin sees as Ukraine. If Putin sees Ukrainians as not separate and really just little brothers, Ukrainians have demonstrated that that is not in fact the case.
Thank you. I think you've made clear that history does play a huge role in this conflict, and it's nothing new that historical narratives are used for war and propaganda. And how would you say is history instrumentalized in the context of this conflict on both sides, as well the Ukrainian one?
So in the context of the current situation, that is Ukrainians literally fighting for their lives and homes or fleeing, history has not really been instrumentalized. Clearly, the instrumentalization of history is coming from the Kremlin. And, you know, witness this law on Friday about falsification or fake news. You know, you can't counter what the Kremlin says about history. I said it a moment ago, but it's worth saying again that Putin has declared Ukraine to be ruled by fascists, and that the goal of Russian troops is to liberate Ukraine and denazify it. And he's also claimed falsely that Russians are suffering genocide in the eastern parts of Ukraine. And then, of course, you throw into that this longstanding notion that Putin has and his supporters have, that Ukraine isn't really a country that taps into these 19th century myths. It is worth saying that one of the ways Putin instrumentalized history is invoking a trend and development in Ukraine that occurred under Viktor Yushchenko, the president of Ukraine, in the wake of the Orange Revolution of 2004. Yushchenko, of course, you know, became president after these protests and turned a little bit rightward, and especially tried to gain a base amongst the Ukrainian nationalists in the West. One of the ways he did so was to allow for Stepan Bandera to be promoted and used on streets and have statues built to him. So Bandera was a fascist in the 1930s who called for an ethnically pure Ukraine and who collaborated with the Nazis in World War II, or at least his followers collaborated with the Nazis in World War II in order to try to bring that about. Bandera himself was in a Nazi concentration camp. There's a lot that's been written about Bandera. I could say a lot more, but Yushchenko, in order to kind of shore up this support, declared Bandera a hero of Ukraine, one of his last acts as president in January 2010. And so Putin has seized on that. That is, in fact, when he calls Ukrainians fascist and calls their leadership fascist, he often calls them Banderites. And he has used this term, both Bandera and Banderites, in a lot of his public speeches, including the annexation of Crimean speech. That is 10 years old. That is the naming of Bandera, hero of Ukraine, occurred in 2010. Viktor Yanukovych, the president who replaced Yushchenko, renounced this revoked the status of Bandera as a hero of Ukraine. Poroshenko made very little about Bandera, and clearly Volodymyr Zelensky hasn't promoted Bandera. I mean, in fact, the counter argument to this notion that really Ukraine is ruled by fascists is the fact that we have a Russian-speaking Jewish president of Ukraine leading this country during this time of crisis and war.
Thank you for clarifying. Well, you've written extensively in Russia and Soviet cultural and media history. In which way do you think is Putin trying to promote the official narrative of the Kremlin and what Putin would probably call Russian patriotism?
So the rise of Putin and Putinism has come alongside the rise of a kind of reinvention of Russian patriotic culture since about 2000, maybe even before. And that is, you know, in the wake of the Soviet collapse, a lot of cultural figures, historians, other public figures tried to fashion a new Russianness after the economic and political turmoils of the 1990s. From about 2000 to 2010, this was relatively banal. That is to say, it took the form of a kind of goulash patriotism. Anything about the past that could be reused and refashioned was deemed good. It helped to fuel Putin's own sentiments, though, about what Russia really was. And once Putin returned to the presidency in 2012, in the wake of these massive protests over a false election in December 2011, he really ratcheted up this patriotism. He appointed Vladimir Medinsky the Minister of Culture in 2012, and Medinsky oversaw a kind of rehauling of the cultural ministry where he explicitly called for more patriotic products to be made to help instill a clearer sense of patriotism amongst Russians, all the way down to Russian school kids. And that meant, in the case of Medinsky, using funds for movies or other cultural products, and supplying funds only in the case of products that were patriotic enough. So, in 2016, Putin also declared the end of this long-going search for a Russian national idea that had first emerged in the 1990s in the wake of the Soviet collapse, and declared that the Russian national idea was patriotism. And this patriotism that Putin has particularly fueled since 2012 is based on the notion that Russians defend their motherland, they respond to crises, they fight whenever they need to, they're surrounded by enemies all around and need to react against that. So this is what's at play now in terms of the way that the Putin regime has now promoted this war. Worth mentioning here, as American movies have pulled out of the market, this weekend, the movies screened across Russia included some of these patriotic products, including a cartoon series based on the mythic exploits of Russian bogatirs, these mythic knights, including Ilya Muromets, on the Russian space age, Brother and Brother 2, these sort of cult movies from the 1990s and early 2000s. And the second part of this, to sort of draw this circle in its complete form, is that the negotiator named by Putin to go to the Belarusian border and negotiate with Ukrainians is none other than the now former cultural minister, Vladimir Medinsky, the person who oversaw this crackdown on culture, who himself emerged in the late 2000s as one of the people associated with the falsification of history panels, and in fact plagiarized his dissertation. I mean, it says all you need to know really about the lack of good faith efforts on the Russian negotiations with the Ukrainians now, that the person sent to oversee them is a cultural minister who helped to instill this very heavy-handed patriotism in Russia over the last 8 years.
Great, thank you very much for the interview and for sharing your point of view with us.
Thank you, Lucas.